Good morning. That's quite a turnout. Try this at home. Lesser known but interesting browser APIs. My name is Flurin. You can find me on Twitter at Flurin. This is me when I still had some kind of fashion sense, I think. Before I get started, I want to show you something I just found last week, and it's about the way the office has changed. It's an animated GIF, and I think it shows something about the world we live in, the technology we can work with, and how amazing that is. Let's have a look. Everything gets replaced by software. And I find this so amazing that barely 30 years ago, we still had all of this stuff, and all of this stuff has been replaced by software. Software we can actually make ourselves. So yeah, there you have, now it starts over again. Okay. So browser APIs. What is a browser API? A browser API is a feature in your browser that you can use or access through JavaScript or Dart if you're using Chrome, or VBScript if that's still a thing. Hope not. Anyone programming in VBScript? Okay, thank God. So that's a browser API. Today I'm going to talk about 7 of them. Some of them are still experimental. You may not be able to use them everywhere, but others are not necessarily new. I hope they're not that old, but they're not like 2013, 2014 new. First, before I start, I wanted to tell you a little bit about why, because recently everything I do, I ask myself, why am I doing this? And to illustrate a point, I want to ask you, does any of you still develop for IE7? Who developed for IE7 last year? You see, IE7 is falling off the radar. IE8, anyone today? Last year. It's like this. We are going forward. We are getting to play with new stuff every day. Well, not every day, but every new browser release. And this is really amazing. And if we cannot use something today, we can still think about it as what I like to call a fallback. You know, you don't have to necessarily make it work the same in every browser or on every device or on every platform. We can even have fall-offs. Do we need this specific feature on every platform? And if we can't help it, where there are still polyfills to fill in this feature in a browser that does not support it yet. Going on about what Bruce said before in his intro, I'm not a big fan of polyfills, but if you load them correctly, there shouldn't be a problem. But remember, the APIs I'm going to talk about today, they are not a goal in itself. Our goals is to, or my goal is to make kick-ass stuff with these technology and these APIs. So the APIs themselves, they're really not a goal, they're just means to an end. Today, I want to talk about the browser as a platform and using that platform to make kick-ass stuff. Well, better yet, I want to talk about the web as a platform and use that platform to make kick-ass stuff. And I hope, and at the end of this talk, you're inspired to use this technology in your next project. It may be a personal project. It may be a project for your boss where it's possible to do something experimental. So when I said this, let's get started. First off, web animations. So what are web animations? Web animations are obviously stuff you can animate. There's a bit of history there. We used to do this through JavaScript, jQuery.animate, anyone? But the thing is, its performance sucks. That's why we got this present from the browser vendors called CSS Transition or CSS Animations. But there is a problem with that. It's very hard to sequence them. It's really hard to have them follow up and control them through JavaScript and say, okay, let's do this part of the animation, now do this part. And it's also very hard to control. You can say you have some control, but it's just quite hard. And of course, there are libraries that solve these problems for us, but some things are still very hard because we can't tweak them from script. You cannot say, okay, we are halfway through this animation, let's go somewhere else, let's do something else, or like you have a fork where you can move an animation to the left or to the right. So what I'm going to show you today is element.animate. It's the web animation API is quite big, but a lot of it has not yet been implemented. There are some polyfills, but element.animate has some support, so I'm going to talk about that. So we have a little bit of code here. I've got element.animate. We select an element in the DOM. We say we want to animate it, and then we're going to say, okay, we want to change the CSS transform property from translate 0, 0 to, when we're done, translate 0.window inner height. And we're going to do this in 1500 milliseconds, so 1.5 seconds. If we run this code, this happens. I can do this again. It's not really interesting, but you know, it proves the point. We have what we saw before. We could just like a duration of we had 1500 milliseconds, but we can also tell it to. We can also pass it a JavaScript object with duration and the numbers of iterations we want to run. If we do that, well, surprise, it does it 3 times. We can also do this with multiple properties. It is important to note, however, we have to define every property on every frame here, because if we are not, the browser is going to complain that he has to interpolate from a property he doesn't know. And we can also add an easing parameter, and I'm seeing there's a bug in the code here. It should be a string, but if we run this, this happens. The element.animate, it will return a player object. Player object we can use to control the playback of the animation. As you see here, I have again an element, we animate it, it takes 3 seconds, and we do it 3 times, but we said after 1.5 seconds we're going to cancel the animation. And of course it does that. There you go. You might have noticed that once the animation is done, it will return to its original position. So we don't really want that in this case, but it would be much nicer if the ball just faded out and would stay away. We can actually do this by using the onFinish property here, player.onFinish, and then we will make the little ball blue. So he does it 2 times, and then we finish, and it's blue. This is all very interesting, of course, but you know, you could also do stuff like this with it. And support is not that great at the moment, but we are going to get it in Chrome, Opera, Firefox is in development, even Safari. Apple is developing this. Microsoft is still thinking about it. But there is a polyfill that will help us overcome of these issues. And of course, there are a lot of libraries around there that help with animation. Thing is that this is native, so it performs a lot better. Next, the Bacon API. No, not so much. The Beacon API. So there is no reason why we can't just combine that and have the, Bacony beacon. So what is it? The Beacon API is used to send back analytics data or any kind of data to the server. There, it's supposed to be small data, and it's yeah, it's a one time you send it and that's it. And the browser will do its utmost best to make these requests to the server. You probably wonder why we are not just using Ajax. Typically, these kind of analytics data, you want to send them out on a window.unload event. And your browser cancels all asynchronous window.unload event, all Ajax requests made in a window.unload. So there are some ways to hack around. You could, for instance, do an asynchronous request, but that would block your browser from navigating to the next page, which would result in worse user interaction and worse feel for the user. So that's why we can't use Ajax. The Beacon API actually makes it possible to do this, but it's a shoot and fire and forget kind of call. So what does this look like? I have here an event listener and on window.unload, and we're going to send beacon/beacon to the URL, the /beacon, and we are going to send the data Elvis has left the building. Of course, you would probably send some more interesting data than just a string, but you know, this for demonstration purposes. I have been running a little web server here on the background. Let's see. Here. Of course, I cannot use the unload event because that would I have to close the page or navigate away from my presentation. That doesn't really work. So I'm going to, I have executed the code, and you can see here, right here, that Elvis has actually left the building. Support. Ooh, this is a terrible one. Chrome behind the flag in Canary, Opera behind the flag. It's in Firefox. It's not supported in Safari. And Microsoft is thinking about it. And there is no polyfill. Because due to the nature of like I talked about, of this API, you have to kind of ensure that the request is sent even if the page has unloaded. And we can't really do that unless we do a lot of hacking, and that works some of the time, and it's not really a good idea. Continuing, I'm going to talk about promises. Promises are not really an API, but they're a language feature of JavaScript, but I think it's a really interesting thing, and that's why I put it in here. A promise is like the eventual result of an asynchronous operation, much like a marriage, and he doesn't really look very happy about it, so that something went wrong in the asynchronous operation. And the best way to explain why this is something good or something we should use is by showing some examples. Let's say we have this code. We have an image on a page. We're going to select the image, and we add an event listener load, and we're going to do some awesome stuff. Except when we run this code, we wait some more, and more. We go grab a coffee, watch a cat video, and wait some more. Because the thing is, the onload event for the image has already been called, even before we registered it. So we have to do this. We are going to put our loaded function in a separate function, and we have to ask the image, has it already been loaded? Then we're going to call our loaded function. If it has not yet loaded, we're going to attach the event handler. Makes for bad, unreadable code if it gets more complex. Another example. Let's say we're building a recipe website with a JSON API. Because we didn't listen to Bruce, we are going to do the empty body tag approach here. I see Bruce is not really into this, but for the sake of the argument, I'm going to continue like this. Let's say we have a recipe.json, which we're going to request through Ajax. I have made this getJSON function that gets the JSON for me and will return this callback. Of course, we want to show the user that something is happening, so we're going to start a spinner. And once we get the recipe.json, we render the recipe title, and we're going to get the separate ingredient URLs. Of course, in a real-world situation, you would never use separate ingredient URLs, but for the sake of the argument, we're using this here. We're going to loop through them, and we're going to get each ingredient URL, and we're going to render that. If this thing fails, we have to handle that. I didn't, as a bad programmer, I didn't catch I caught the error, but I chose to ignore it. And if everything breaks, we are going to just stop the spinner and render, yeah, something went wrong. The thing is, when we look at this code, getting the ingredient URLs, there is a problem. Let's say the second ingredient takes longer to load than the second ingredient is faster than the first ingredient. So the order of ingredients would kind of be random according to server load or just how much work it is to get that ingredient. So we have to do a lot of work to make this work. I have here somewhat contrived example where I just have an array and we are going to push all loaded ingredients into the array, and if everything is done, if the length of the ingredients URL matches the length of the loaded URLs, we're going to render everything and we're going to stop the spinner, etc., etc. This would result in this code. And that pretty much looks like this. So what if we had promises? First, before I'm going to show you how we can solve some of these problems by promise, I'm going to talk about some of the vocabulary of promises. A promise can be caught with the catch function, which accepts a callback. It's being called when your asynchronous operation has failed. Then you got the then function, which also accepts a callback. Actually, it accepts two callbacks, one for if it succeeds and one if it fails. Catch is just some curry on that. And of course, you can do promise.all, which is really interesting because you can say, OK, I'm going to do these 5 things, and you just wait until everything is done and then continue. There's also a promise itself. It can be fulfilled or resolved. This is what we call when a promise has succeeded. So your asynchronous operation went well, and the resolved callback will be called. Promise can be rejected if it failed, didn't work. Can be pending. This is the state where it's in when we have not yet, we don't know what the result is going to be. And there is the settle, if a promise can be settled, which just means it can be either resolved or rejected. OK, let's go look at the code again. If we had, let's say we had the browser vendors would have implemented the ready promise on images. Most unfortunately, they didn't, but if they would have, we could do something like this, image.ready, and when we're ready, we're going to do this. This gets called immediately if the operation would already been done, or it would be called somewhere in the future whenever the image has been loaded. Let's look at this example, at a more complicated example again, where we are going to get the recipe items. I've rewritten the code to work with promises here. I did this by I rewrote the getJSON function to return a promise. So all we have to do is we have to start the spinner. We're going to get the recipe.json. And when that's done, we're going to catch the recipe title. And then here it gets interesting. We just ask promise.all, OK, go get all URLs. I'm using the array map function here to just call getJSON on every URL. And when they are all done, we're going to loop through them, render them, stop the spinner, and if stuff fails, we have a catch here. This is nice, but it's not really webby, because we have to wait until every request is done. That's like, OK, I'm going to do a request, and then another request. I'm going to wait until everything is done. But we could render the first ingredient when it comes in. So that's why I have actually I'm going to call them in order. What I'm doing here, I'm starting a sequence, which I do by calling promise.resolve, which will result into a fulfilled promise. So this is actually a resolved promise. So I can then chain it. We're going to map each ingredient URL onto getJSON to get the different URLs for the ingredients. And then we're going to loop through the promises, because this returns an array of promises. We're going to loop through them, and we're going to add them to our sequence. So that way, these get fired off immediately, and then when they are done here, they will render them in sequence as they come in. And if we're done with this whole complicated thing above, we're just stopping the spinner, and if it fails, we're going to do this. Well, I'm going to show you how this actually looks step by step. I'm going to open the web inspector here. Let me clear that. So first, we're going to start the spinner. That's working. And then we're going to call the getRecipe.json. As you see at the left-hand side, it has requested recipe.json, has returned, and we can render the title. The next thing is we're going to send off 4 or 5, I don't know exactly how many ingredients are in there, requests at once to get the ingredients. When I press the button, they will show up here simultaneously. But as you see, they appeared in order because one of these I took a bit longer to get than the others. And as we're done now, we're going to stop the spinner, and we're done. It might be interesting to tell you that the step-by-step code I show here is actually executing the code, and I use a promise to make the execution stop and continue again. But while promises are really cool and really interesting, you can do a lot of good stuff with it, they're not for everything. It's not a replacement for events, because stuff like repetitive, promise can only be fulfilled once, or rejected once. So stuff like keyboard input, where you have a key that can be pressed multiple times, or mouse events, are not for promises, because these are repetitive things and cannot be solved by promises. But one-off things like firing off an AJAX request, that should only return once, because you get a response from the server, so that can only happen once. Support is actually pretty good. We have got it in Chrome, Opera, Firefox, and we should be getting it somewhere next week in Safari. And even Microsoft is on board. They're working on it. So maybe IE 12, 13, I don't know. And there, of course, there are plenty of libraries, because this is something that you can easily implement in a library. And you probably are wondering why I'm talking about this as a native API. The thing is, other browser APIs are going to use these promises to, just like I showed on the image, which is a hypothetical example, but newer APIs will use them, and they can only use them if promises are a native features, because the browser cannot say, okay, you want to use this API, I have to download this library first to do this. So that's why they're native. Okay, next, WebAudio. Ruth had already talked, if you have been here in the previous talk, Ruth had already talked about it a little bit. So what I'm going to do, a little introduction demo. So what's the WebAudio API? It's a way to actually a boombox in your browser, and you can control it, or more like a DJ station. You can control audio, you can analyze it, you can do all kinds of stuff. But you can also generate sounds, like with an oscillator. You can generate waves, you can generate noise if you want. You can do visualizations and analysis. And you can do spatial sounds, and this is something I really love, because if you're making a game, are now able to, if something happens on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a sound with it, you can also control how much of that sound is coming out of your right speaker or your left speaker. This is something I really, really think is great. And you got exact timing control, and this is quite important too if you're doing mixing and stuff like that, that you have an exact control over timing. So let's see how this works. The WebAudio API defines nodes, where you have a source node that can be a microphone, that can be an oscillator, that can be a sound file, that can even be some remote sound API. I think Sid is going to talk about that tomorrow. So that's the source. That's where your audio is coming from. But then you can put intermediate nodes in after it, where you can transform the sound or analyze the sound. And in the end, you're going to want to send it to a destination, which can be a file or speakers or something like that. And in code, it looks like this. I have to create an audio context first. This is just like a container for my nodes to be in. As you see, I have still got a get function that returns a promise. I have to get my MP3 as an array buffer because it's binary data and not text data. And once I have done that, I have to decode the audio data, the raw audio data, into a buffer, which I return here, and here is where the magic is happening. We are creating a source node from this audio buffer by doing context.createBufferSource. We are assigning the buffer to the source node, and here is where the magic happens because we connect the source node directly to the destination node, and we are just going to start it at time 0. So if we run this code, we are going to hear this. It's not that interesting, but it works. In this next example, I have abstracted the get function into a get sound, so we don't have to worry about decoding stuff again. And once we get the sound, we are not only we are creating a buffer source again, we're saying it should loop when we're going to play it, but in between the destination node and the source node, we're going to add a gain node to control volume. So we create gain on the context, then we say, okay, the volume is going to 0.5, it's like half volume, and we're going to connect the source to the gain and the gain to the destination, and we're going to play it. So here we go, and I have put a little slider here just to demonstrate that it works instantly. This all may look a bit confusing, and that's why in Firefox Aurora they made an web audio visualizer, and I'm going to show you that because that makes a whole lot of it more clear. I've opened the web inspector here on the web audio tab. It's not that readable, but when I go to my next example, you can see I have put together a little drum machine. It sounds horrible. I'm going to turn up the volume in a bit. But you can see here that I have an audio buffer source, a gain node, and a destination node. And I've just got this 3 times for the piano, for the drums, and below here is for the bass. In between, you see a convolver node. A convolver node is another intermediate node you can use to manipulate the sound. So if I play this, it's kind of out of sync, but when I can just add the convolver node here, and you can hear that it sounds differently, like over a telephone, or if you're playing in a warehouse. So that's the web audio API. I just want to show you one more thing, and that's the a little demo that somebody put together. It's a WebAudio drum machine, and I can play this, and I can actually just add. I can add more beats here. I'm no musician, so I'm not really good at that. And when I play it, you hear something like this. And this is live manipulated from the browser, which is, I think, that's pretty amazing. Support. Also not too bad. Chrome, Opera, Firefox, even Safari, at least on desktop. On mobile, it has some quirks. And Microsoft is working on this. And there are some polyfills. The bad thing, however, bad news is that they require Flash or Silverlight to make everything work, to get the timings right and stuff like that, and the effect nodes and stuff like that. Okay, let's continue. CSS Feature Queries. Who here uses Moderniser? That's quite a lot. CSS Feature Queries are like Moderniser, but built in. So you don't have to load the library anymore. You can use it from CSS with an add supports rules. Of course, you can use it from JavaScript as well, because otherwise it wouldn't be in this talk. And the best thing is, when you use it in older browsers, the add supports rule in CSS just gets ignored. You may have to do some work in JavaScript to make it work, but in older browsers, but it doesn't break anything. And this is really neat, I think, because not having to load a library just to, check if we can use Flexbox is just very nice, because it saves you a lot of bytes and a lot of weird thing you have to deal with yourself. So what does this look like? From JavaScript, we can ask it, okay, css.supports, and then we hear it pretty much looks like a media query string. We're asking it if it does display flex and display block. Or we have the alternative variant where you can ask css.supports for the display property, the value magic. Of course, if you run this code, you see there is no such thing as display magic, but the flex and block are actually supported in the browser I'm running this presentation in. And the same thing from CSS. We have an add supports rule, display flex and display block, and add supports display magic. When, well, it doesn't work, it's kind of the same thing. Support is surprisingly good, and it's going to get better, because even Safari and IE are going to support it. And there are polyfills, of course. Moderniser is kind of like a polyfill for this. And I think there are some others as well. Okay, next thing, web notifications. I have to exit full screen mode here, because otherwise they won't show up. Web notifications are a way to notify the user outside of the browser window, like a pop-up message, or on your phone you would get a notification. And now we can get them in the web browser as well, which is really interesting. Because if you, for instance, are building a chat application, you can notify other people when someone is coming online. Or you can notify, if you have a build system, you can notify your user when the build has succeeded or failed. The only thing is that you have to have the tab open. It's not something that is going to work if you have the website not open. It doesn't have to be in front of it. And there is a proposal, actually, that's working to make this work without having the tab open through Service Worker, which is really interesting. So let's see, what does it look like? We have, it's pretty easy, actually. You have a notification, create a new notification, we have a title, and then we're going to have a body, and that should work. Except it doesn't. You have to do some more stuff to make this work. Because out of security, you have to ask permission to be able to show notifications. So let's see, we have a notify function that does the actual notification. Then we're going to ask if we have permission to show the notification. If we have it, we're going to display our notification immediately. If we don't have it, we're going to request permission, and then when we request permission, if we got permission, we're going to notify as well. So when I run this code, before I run this code, I have whipped up something which we could do if we have promises, because that would be a lot more simple. We could just request permission, and if that succeeded and we have permission granted, we can just do the whole thing, because we don't have to check if we already have permission, and then if not, add an event to, etc., etc., etc. So let's run this code. As you might have noticed, the browser has asked for permission. I'm going to click Allow now, and there we have it, our first notification. This is a more elaborate example because we can also add an icon to our notification, and we can tag the notification. Tagging is quite useful because that way we can replace existing notification. If we use the same tag, we can replace a notification that's already in screen. We can add in a show event listener so we know when it has shown up, which is quite useful if you do not know if you have permission at or when you get permission. We can close a notification, which I'm doing here after 5 seconds. We have a close event and a click event. And if we run this code, you're going to see it has shown, and when I click it, it has clicked. The funny thing is the close event isn't being called when I click it, but when we get actually the close function is being called, which is kind of weird, I think, but maybe an implementation bug, I don't know. Support is okay-ish. Well, you got your usual suspects. Even Safari works on desktop. Microsoft is still thinking about it. There are some polyfills for this, but they're like alternative representations. They're not the same because you don't have access to like a pop-up like you saw before. So for IE, they have flashing title bars or things like this. Last but not least, I'm going to talk about Screen Orientation API, which is different from the Device Orientation API, because the Screen Orientation API just tells you if your device or your screen is in landscape or portrait mode, and it has always a value. It even has a value for devices that do not themselves know their orientation. Like my laptop, it doesn't know what orientation it has, and it still can have a device orientation, a screen orientation. And you can use it to lock the screen orientation, which is something new we couldn't do before. Or we had to do a lot of hacking to compensate for the fact that you turned your device. Okay, let's look at some code. We can ask the screen orientation, and it can have 4 values. It can have landscape primary, landscape secondary, portrait primary, and portrait secondary. You might wonder why there are 4, because this is the primary is the preferred orientation. If I hold my phone like with the buttons on top, it's the secondary orientation. If I hold them with the buttons at the bottom, it's portrait primary orientation. It's kind of a useful distinction, I think. And we can lock the screen by requesting orientation lock. We want to lock it at landscape. And this API actually uses promises, as you can see. And then we get a callback if it's locked. And if it didn't work out or the user didn't allow the lock, we're going to end up in the catch function. Important thing to note is that this API does not allow locking when you're not in full screen mode, because that wouldn't actually make any sense. If you'd have like a multiple window application or a multiple window device, and one of these windows would request, okay, I'm going to lock the screen now, and it's not controlling all of the screen, that will give quite weird effects. Support, not that great. It's not yet in Chrome. It's not yet in Opera. It is in Firefox, mostly for Firefox OS, I think. Safari is unknown. But it's in Internet Explorer 11, surprisingly. Okay, that were 7 APIs. And again, why? Why did I show you this? Because we can use most of this today. And we should think of these things as enhancements. It doesn't have to work in every browser exactly the same. Not all features have to be available in IE8, I think. I firmly believe we should experiment with this, and we should drive these features. Because browser vendors, and I hope I'm right here, Bruce, browser vendors, they're not just making features for the sake of it. And if we're not using these features, they will eventually probably stop making new features. And they want to hear feedback on these features as well, because this is not fixed. When we use them and we find new use cases, they're going to listen to us, and they're going to try to accommodate it if it's a good idea. So I hope you're hungry for more. And just this morning, I said on Twitter, there's these dashboards like the IE platform status or the Chromium dashboard, or even can I use. When I built this presentation, what I did is I looked at the IE platform status, at the Chromium platform status, and I looked at the features they're working on. And I do this actually not only for this presentation, I do it every couple of months. I'm going to scroll through the list and I'm thinking, hey, this is interesting. We can do something with this. And sometimes I think, okay, I don't know what kind of use you could do of this. Other times I think, this is pretty neat. I think I should make a demo with it, or I use it in my next project. And I hope you will too, because there is so much more. Really, there are a lot of APIs out there, and we can make really a lot of kick-ass stuff with it. Having said that, thank you very much.